once he realized that he was having negative thoughts about his professor, and it occurred to him that if it was a man, he wouldn't be having those same thoughts. Don't get me wrong, student evaluations are an invaluable resource where we have the ability to see at an anonymous level students' actual honest feedback on our pedagogy. I have read my student evaluations carefully through the years. I've seen certain patterns of things that I wanted to correct. I've seen positive feedback about things that I wanted to do more of. And this has changed my teaching through the years. I've been very grateful for my students for being so honest about their feedback of my class. And I do incentivize my students to take student evaluations, so I try to get feedback from as many of them as possible. So it's not as though the entire system of student evaluations needs to get thrown out the window, but if we are ever going to use student evaluations as a resource to determine whether somebody should remain in a job, get tenure, get promoted within a job, then it needs to be taken into account that women and people of color, BIPOC people, are judged more harshly than white men. Study after study after study has shown, particularly, that women are scored differently than men. This famous study conducted in 2014, there were 4 sections of this class, and 2 of the sections were taught by a man, and 2 of the sections were taught by a woman. But because it was an online class, they were able to keep invisible from the students who was actually teaching them. So for 2 of the sections, they actually switched names. And so a student might be under the impression that a woman was teaching them, but it was actually a man, or the reverse. A student might be under the impression that they were being taught by a man, but it was actually a woman. When it was thought that you were taught by a woman, a man received harsher student evaluation scores. This study, which came out just this year, showed what the researchers deem backlash after grading. Students were given evaluations of their professors on day 2, so they'd already had a little bit of interaction with their professors and they had an impression of who they were. Now, this was a class that was taught by both men and women. The material for the class and the way it was disseminated was quite similar across the board. And so on day 2 of the class, there was a fairly equal feedback between men and women. But after the first assessment came back, after the first exam was graded, women received a much lower score than the men teaching the same class. There are studies that try to equalize this story by telling students before they do an evaluation, they try to tell students to be aware of their own biases. They are shown studies that show gender biases, and inevitably the students are not able to recognize their own biases, and women professors are still coming up short. You can put all the studies you want in front of people, but they have to experience it for themselves. It's likely that there haven't been a lot of stories yet by the time that you are only 18, 20 years old, that you haven't accumulated enough experiences yet to understand that gender bias is a real thing. And of course, a man in a position of privilege oftentimes will not have access to those stories at all. It will take them much, much longer to hear story after story after story till they start to believe in the first place that gender bias is a real thing, much less that they might be judging their professors harshly. When I was 16 years old and working my first job at a restaurant, I had a manager. She was an assistant manager. I believe to this day, she's actually probably one of the best managers I've ever had. She just had a knack for managing people, a real laid-back style, very competent, very hardworking. There was an opening at the store for the general manager, and we all agreed, this woman had been at the company for 2 years. At this store, we all agreed, well, she was a shoo-in for the position. They ended up hiring a man from an outside candidate. They hired a man into the position. And that was my first experience of, did her gender have something to do with it? So at the age of 16, I had my first experience of maybe gender bias factored into this hiring decision. It really didn't seem to be the right way to go. Maybe they just wanted a man in the position. So I was only starting to have these thoughts because of this one specific experience that I had. Well, plunging myself into the world of science, of course, as a woman, you start to have more and more experiences. And the science classes that I took coming up, and the math classes, and chemistry and physics, all the classes that I was taking, I wouldn't say that I felt a lot of difference from classmates who were men versus classmates that are women. I just didn't feel anything at that time. I was too young. I hadn't accumulated enough experiences. But as I progressed, through grad school and through my career, I started to accumulate these experiences until it became very real for me. And it's hard to discern when a student leaves a harsh evaluation. Of course, you take it on its face value. You start to say, oh, okay, that should be something that I should be working on. And that is actually true. Like, there's validity to that. There just is. I mean, it could honestly be the truth. But is it possible that there could be other factors playing into it? Is it possible that me being a woman meant that the student was viewing me more negatively in this way? Again, study after study after study shows this to be the truth, but on an individual basis, it's painful to have that realization for yourself. So let me tell you about the story of my husband. My husband, of course, he's a white man. He's been quite privileged. He had an excellent university education. He had a stable upbringing in a standard Midwestern town. There was really no reason for him to investigate the dynamics of gender bias up until, of course, he met me. He met me and he started caring about the plight of women in science because I was experiencing those things. And just like me, he had a hard time sorting out when I had a bad experience at work, whether maybe the fact that I was a woman played into some of these stories. Maybe it did. And as I accumulated more and more of these stories and he started seeing the world a little bit through my eyes, he started seeing some truths that not everybody would necessarily be exposed to. So now he's in a graduate level program. He is taking classes for a master's degree. And he was most of his professors are men. He took one class so far from a woman. And he sat me down about halfway through the semester and said, you know something? I think that I expected this class to be easier because she was a woman. And I said, Dave, how could you have that thought after all that I've been through teaching difficult classes and having my students judge me harshly? Haven't you learned that women have every right to be as rigorous as men? And he said, I know, I'm just finding myself having these thoughts. Well, kudos to Dave, that he had the realization that he had these biased thoughts and he was going to move forward and have a real conscious experience of making sure that he was not judging this woman more harshly than he was judging the men that he had had. So I pulled him aside. Of course, I asked permission to tell this story, and he said, that's fine. And I followed up a little bit. I said, when did you have this realization? Was it that you went into the course thinking that it was going to be easier, that she was going to be nicer, that it wasn't going to be as rigorous? He said, I don't know. I said, was it after you saw the workload and were kind of dismayed that it wasn't lighter than the workload you were given in A courses? He said, I'm not sure, but he did say at one point he realized several weeks into the course, he realized that he was having negative thoughts about his professor, and it occurred to him that if it was a man, he wouldn't be having those same thoughts. He's 45. And it's only through decades, we've been together for 20 years, it's only through decades of story after story, all the research that I do, all the conversations that we have, all the workplace incidents that I've been exposed to, only after all of that, and also, of course, to give credit to his workplace, he is going to a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion seminars. He's starting to see the world in a slightly different way than his own perspective, that of a white man raised in a standard Midwestern society and given a liberal arts education. He's starting to see another side of the world through those seminars as well. So all of these accumulated experiences have finally found him understanding some biases about himself. People, this is a long game that we are playing. We have to keep at it. We have to keep talking about our experiences. Don't be ashamed of your experiences as a woman in science, and don't take the blame on yourself. Yes, you're an imperfect person and sometimes you make mistakes, but keep telling the stories and saying, if it had been a man in this position, would this particular disciplinary action have been as harsh? If it was a man in my position, would my student evaluation scores have been so low? Of course, we have put together enough information to understand that surely if you were a man, your scores would not have been as low. So in next week's video on bias, I'm going to pull together my courage and we're going to take a close look at my own student evaluations through the years and rate my professor scores and talk about some comments that students have left for me personally, because I think it's only going to be through telling these stories that we'll start to create the actual truth around this, and not just in an academic sense where we're surveying, 1,000 students and finding trends. I think that we need actual personal stories of these biases in order that we can start to evaluate ourselves fairly, state whether or not we're experiencing bias in this moment, whether we are perpetuating bias on somebody else. The only way we're ever going to get to these truths is to keep telling our stories.